Well, let you take more command of this, and I won't branch off. I'll just give you shorter answers to questions, and you'll have to follow up if you want more.
Yeah.
So, well, let's talk about the Grove for a minute, because it's a very interesting story and a very important one about the history of the Grove and how Sid was involved with that.
Right.
Can you start a little bit at the beginning of the history of how we became the benefactors of the Max Cohen Memorial Grove?
Well, I was on the board of selectmen, and I knew that we had lots of problems with the strip of land that was between the road and the main part of the camp. And then we knew they had a lot of problems. And so we talked about what we could do with that land in order to make it more successful.
And when you say problems, you're talking about?
Junk, just trashed the whole area. People who came through, some of them were local people, but quite often there were people that pulled over and just trashed the area. It was not a...
Plus swimming, people who wanted to swim in the lake had only the one little area and were all crammed together. I remember there was just a lot of pressure for having a nice swimming area.
There was a lot of pressure in the community for the fact that there was no swimming area for Brookline people. Here's this beautiful little lake, and nobody had access to the lake legally to go swimming. If they had to trespass if they wanted to do it, and trespass they did, and it was a real mess. And it was a serious problem for the authorities in Brookline, as well as a problem for the camp. And so there was a lot of pressure to do something about it. And there was pressure from the kids who wanted to go swimming, and people who grew up in the town who remembered going swimming at the Ice House Beach. They all felt deprived by the situation that had developed in that no man's land where everybody was trespassing and making a mess out of it. And so that was the push that was going on. And Sid stepped into that push by making a proposal to the camp leaders that he'd clean up, get the youth groups to clean up that mess if we could work out a way for them to be able to swim. Well, they had to think about all those things of who's going to watch it, who's going to enforce it, how much is it going to cost to do it, and eventually it had to be a real bureaucratic solution. And the bureaucratic solution was for the camp to give that area to the town and have the town take certain responsibilities that the camp wanted to see fulfilled. And it was a win-win situation for both sides to sit down together and figure out what to do about a situation that had developed in the town. And I think a lot of us had various roles to play in doing it, but Sid had a proposal and he went to them and they said, yes, we're interested. And then everybody sat down together to work out the solution. And among other things was a feeling that we could have a nice park-like area and be a memorial to somebody that we wanted to memorialize, and the camp wanted to to honor Max Cohen, and so they were very responsive to that. And when they thought they wanted to do that, then they were willing to put in some money. And the camp started carrying its weight too, because there was considerable dissatisfaction among some of the people in town that we provided services, police services and fire protection services and other services to the camp, and they got it for free. They were a tax-free institution. So it solved a lot of problems for us to sit down together and work that out, and I think that's the way it real impetus for getting started. And to a very great extent, it has proved to be very successful in doing almost all of those objectives. It had its own problems to develop because it turned out to be a nice area, and we got the state to take care of the access to the lake at that corner. They had never taken every public water has to have a public access, and the state is responsible for that. And they were supposed to be responsible for seeing to it that it was policed properly, but we had to do the policing of it. And they weren't doing their part either. And so as time went on, once it got to be a really nice area, a nice place for people to swim, and there was policing and there was sanitation and all of the necessary things for something like that, then everybody came. Everybody wanted to come from everywhere. It wasn't just for the town alone. So all that had to be worked out too. It was a big, long process. And Sid's proposal was just the beginning of it, because that was the first time the camp really responded.
You remember what time frame, what year that may have all begun?
It had to be before baseball season, I have a feeling, because the kids were having ball games at the ballpark. And all that time, we were also working on getting the ballpark to be a decent place, because it wasn't taken care of either.
But was this back in the 60s?
I would say the 50s.
I don't think the 50s. Well, we can find out when the Max Cohen Cove was donated.
50s and 60s was after the ice house burned down, of course. That was, before that, it was a whole different situation. I can't give you really good dates because I don't remember. But I think that the research is available to be done right through the town offices on a lot of that stuff. Unfortunately, and I know it well, the Board of Selectmen didn't keep minutes most of that time. And when I went on the Board of Selectmen, I instituted keeping minutes, and so guess who had to do them? Me. And and we had no secretarial help. We did all our own correspondence and everything. So guess who did it? Me. And guess what else I was doing? You can see that it didn't get done very well back in that era. And your research will be interesting, to say the least. When I went on the Board of Selectmen, the other two selectmen had been on a while, and they were not happy to have me come on the board. And they used to close, when the meeting started, they'd close the door to the office and pull down all of the shades, and nobody was allowed in while we were meeting. Nobody. Somebody knock on the door. Sorry, can't come in. That was the way business was handled.
Hey, can you talk about when you and first moved to town, how there were two churches, the Methodist Church and the Congregational Church, and...
Are you ready for that?
Sure.
Okay. Well, what he just said is exactly the start of it all. I had, well, it wasn't really the start of it all, because I had come up with many years before that for lots of different affairs, and I had gone to the two churches, but the two churches were at odds with each other all the time. They were rivals. They were not cooperators at all. The Methodist Church and the Congregational Church. And when I first got up there to live, it was a whole different story. I had to decide which church I was going to go to and all that. So I went to the Congregational Church because I had been very active in the Congregational Church in Concord, New Hampshire, before I moved to Brookline to live. And so I had gotten to know all the people in the Congregational denominations hierarchy when I lived and worked in Concord. So first I went there. There were 4 people there, and the minister was hired by the conference and didn't live in town, and came for an hour on Sunday morning, and that's all he did. He put on a service for an hour on Sunday morning. He didn't call, he didn't do anything. The church had no organization. So then the next week I went to the Methodist Church, and the same situation existed in the Methodist Church, just as bad. Nobody was paying attention. And they had a young student pastor who came and was paid to come for just a very limited amount of time. So I picked myself up and went up to the conference and to talk to the people I knew at the conference, and I said, what are you going to do about this? You've been sending a minister down here and paying a minister, and there's nothing happening at all. It isn't a church at all. And the conference minister was a wonderful man, and I already knew him quite well. And he said, well, what are you going to do about it? And I said, well, I want you to get something started, and then maybe I can help. He says, no, you get something started, and I'll help. And and that was a real challenge to me. I was going to have to take the initiative to get those two churches together. So I started talking to the young minister, who was a very nice young man, and we started thinking and working to see how we could get those two churches together. Well, most everybody that was still around that had been members of either of the two churches weren't talking to each other. They didn't want to talk to each other. They didn't like each other, and there was not going to be any cooperation out of them. So I decided to talk to the woman who was in the Catholic Church. She was a Fessenden, and the Fessendens were the town leaders, and the Farwells, the Fessendens and the Farwells, and they were feuding all through those years. In everything, not just the church. And so anyway, I talked to, I can't think of her name. She was a wonderful lady. And she was a very good Catholic, and she said, why don't we have a summer church school and have all the kids in town come? Catholics, Protestants, anybody can come to the church Sunday school, and we'll hire somebody to come and put it on. And she said, I'll help you raise the money. And so I drew up a little plan, and I went back up to the conference, and they said, that's a good idea, and we will supply you with a young couple to work with the young minister in the other church, and we will have a really good vacation Bible school for everybody in the community, non-denominational. And it was a huge success. Every kid in town came to that. And the parents were thrilled with it. And it went on for a month. And it was very unusual. And the young couple stayed at our house. You probably never heard this part of the story. And they were delightful. And we enjoyed them. And I went to see the Methodist conference people, the congregational conference minister picked up the telephone, called the Methodist conference head, and arranged for all the parties to get together and talk about doing this wonderful Bible school and hiring just the right people to do it. So anyway, it worked. And when the fall rolled around, well, what do we do now? We can't let this thing drop. And so both churches started having Sunday school, one in one church and then the other, for the next winter. And there still were only about 4 people in church every Sunday, but we had a huge Sunday school going on. And that went on for, I guess, about a winter. And then by that time, there were a lot of parents of the children who wanted to see things happen that came from different denominations and different things. But it was all ecumenical, including the Catholics, which was very unusual back then. And so eventually, all 3 churches built up their congregations, getting involved with doing things with the Sunday school and keeping that Sunday school alive. And we had another very successful vacation Bible school the next year. And by that point, we needed places for the kids to have their activities. And it was silly to heat 2 churches for 4 people. So we decided that we would close the Methodist church and just have services in the congregational church. And there was enough Sunday school space in the congregational church for a while. But then we ran out of that, and the Methodist church was just sitting there. And I'm not sure I'm getting this in the right chronological order, but we eventually decided to turn the Methodist church into a youth center. And and the Methodist church had a beautiful organ. Oh, this was a funny, really, the kind of things that happen in little towns. We decided that we would sell that organ that was in the Methodist church. In the meantime, we had also been talking about who owned what property and so on. So we decided to sell the Methodist church organ, and we got I can't remember the amount of money, but it was huge compared to anything else that anybody was willing to put into the thing. We sold that beautiful organ. And we took out all the stuff and we turned the whole Methodist church into a gymnasium. And we had basketball games, and we had dancing school, and we had every kind of activity for about 10 years in that Methodist church building as a youth center. And that lasted until we built a new school in town, and and we put a gym in the new school, and the gym was ever so much more better for all the activities than the youth center. And the school had started a physical education program, which they had never had. And so the uses for the Methodist church building ceased to be very needed. And there was a good deal of conflict still going on between the two churches. So the youth groups ceased to use the Methodist church building, and it just sat there, and nothing was happening with it. And there was Phil and Midge Chandler were very interested in seeing if we couldn't get the Methodist church to sell the building to the congregational church people and make one congregation and one piece of property. Up to that point, we were just operating ad hoc, doing what we could do just on our own. Well, they wanted to see it formalized into and they did a huge amount of work. And Mitch Chandler went to the history, did a huge amount of research. Did you know Mitch Chandler at all?
I had met her.
She was very she wasn't either a Congregationalist or a Methodist, and she was much more interested in the history and keeping these historic buildings together and all that kind of stuff. And in order to get the two churches to become one church, she did all of the research of going back through the records to see who had the ownership of the Methodist church. Congregational church was clear. It was owned by the conference. But the Methodist church, it was totally unclear who even owned it, how the town ever got it. And she did all that research, and she found one heir that had been on the deed that gave the property to the Methodist church, and he gave that property to the town. And we worked out the whole deal where the town would turn that into a library, and we would have the money to go ahead with doing all of these things. It's not at all clear in my mind all the steps that went into that, but it was a huge project, and it never would have happened without Midge's just going through all those old records and finally finding this one guy. He's the only one left alive that had anything to do with it, and he signed off on it, and the town acquired the building.
Yeah.
And that's when it became the library. And that happened after about 10 years of being a youth center.
See, I would have thought it was
So when he was growing
quite a
up,
bit longer than that.
you did a lot of, you went to the youth center events.
Oh yeah, we always, there were dances and
We did everything with those,
badminton.
with that youth group. At one time we had 3 different youth groups operating in that building. And we had a junior high, a senior high, and the kindergarten kids, young kids operating in that building. And we had that building going every minute with all kinds of activities. But once the school got built, that changed the whole picture. Before the new school was built, there was no place for the kids to have their activities. So there were none for them. And everything was done through the youth group. And it was a very good period for them. The drum and bugle corps met in the youth center, and they did their practicing and their music and all of that kind of stuff. It was hopping. So anyway, that's the story of the 2 churches coming together, and over the period of time, eventually, the town got the building of the method. We would never have settled all the arguments between those 2 denominations if we had not gotten rid of the one building, so there was only one building for us to have to deal with, and that worked.
Betty, was there controversy about what building would remain? Between
There was an awful lot of controversy, and I don't even remember what all of it was, but there were times when people weren't speaking to each other, including me. They wouldn't speak to me. The Wards had grown up. Do you know the Wards?
Yes, I do.
The Wards had grown up in that church. I got along mostly pretty well with Connie Ward, but there was an awful lot of controversy, a huge amount of bad feelings about different things. It was unbelievable how many unpleasant incidents we had, as well as some really wonderful activities and wonderful memories for kids. I have kids come now and drop in and see me and say they remember when they were growing up in Brookline and being part of the youth groups and all that stuff. So on balance, it was very worthwhile, but there was an awful lot of guff that went with it. It was just...
How much time did that transition take?
Oh, from 1950 to the present. There's still people who fuss over the library.
But the library, when did the library get moved to there? That was pretty recent, wasn't it?
That was relatively recent, within the last 20 or 30 years, I think.
I think it was always the library since I've lived here. We've been in Brookline for 28 years.
I didn't hear that, Des.
Barry and I moved in to Brookline 28 years ago, and I think the library was already the library at that point.
Oh.
I think.
It was somewhere in there. Sid, my husband Sid, died 25 years ago. So I date a lot of things to before he died and after he died. So I think most of that was after he died.
It could be, but because I was working.
So it was right about
there were a lot
that.
of things I did not know about the town because I was too busy working in Milford.
Do you remember why they chose to make the Methodist Church the youth center and the Congregational Church the church, as opposed to vice versa?
The combined group needed dining room and a kitchen and all those facilities, and the Congregational Church had them all. They had the downstairs dining room, so it was much, and the upstairs sanctuary. The sanctuary was big enough to hold everybody. It was in both churches. So, and the Methodist Church was much easier to transform. There was not the number, it didn't have a kitchen, it didn't have a dining room, it didn't have a bathroom, it didn't have this, and it didn't have that.
What kind of organ was it? Was it a pipe organ or electric organ?
It was a pipe organ,
Wow.
and it was a beautiful, beautiful organ. It was a shame that we had to sell it, but it was the price we paid for bringing the two churches together. We never would have done it without it.
Yeah.
I think some of the pipes are still in the stairway going upstairs in the library.
I didn't hear you.
I think some of the pipes are still in the stairway going up to the second floor in the library as well, if those are the same pipes.
Yeah, I think they probably are.
Yeah.
I'll tell you another you want funny stories or don't you want funny
Sure.
stories? One of the funniest stories was we were at church in the middle of a service, and a bird flew in the window of the church and started flying around in the church, and he landed on the pipe organ, and he found a hole, and the bird went down into the hole. All the time that the minister was preaching, he couldn't see it. It was behind him, and everybody in the church was laughing and giggling and wondering what's going to happen to that bird when the organist started to play the next hymn. And the minister didn't know what was going on, and we watched it, and the organist started to play, and the bird was flopping up and down inside the pipe, and finally the bird got out, and it was just about dead from being in that pipe organ, by that time the minister didn't know what was going on, and they stopped the service and they got the bird out of the church. But it was an incident that none of us ever forgot. It was such, especially his face when he finally found out what was going on and why this laughter was going on all through his sermon. So that was a funny story. Then
There's anything about the pipe organ.
You want to talk briefly about schools or hold that one off?
I think I'd like to hold that one up,
Okay.
so we can get
Yeah.
going. I hate to leave
we'll
because-
do any amount more. I got a million more funny stories.
Oh, I know you do.
too.
We're gonna have to make that another session if it's gonna include me.
Betty, thank you very much for your time.
It's
Thank
fun.
you.
It's fun. I
But if you're gonna
have
be up here for a
enjoyed
while,
having.
for coming up again, it's just, pre-warned Barry that it'll be a little longer than.
Well, if we do anything more up here, we'll probably do it next year. Because you've got another year or so of this work to do before you start to have to write up their stories.
I don't know, according to your son, we have 6 months.
Okay.
No, not for everything.
Well, no, but
For first drafts of things, many stories.
There are some cute
we need a
pictures.
time frame.
I'm wondering if it says anything about that organ in the Old Town.
I don't think it does, because this was written before that transaction took place.